My name is Gene Rice, and I'm an Associate Professor of Philosophy at Fort Hays State University. And today's video lecture's title is Utilitarianism. You may be taking this or watching this video as a part of an applied ethics course, a political philosophy course, or an introduction to ethics course. So we're going to do a little bit of introduction and a little bit of review before we get to the main topic of the day, which is utilitarianism. So the first 4 or 5 slides and the first few minutes here will hopefully be review for all of you. And also I would note again that these PowerPoint slides will be made available to you in one format or another for all the classes. So you need not worry about taking down all of the points that are made, but rather attempt to understand what's going on, and then you can connect that understanding back with the PowerPoint slides as need be later. So let's begin then with our review. The theory of utilitarianism is both an important moral and political theory, and it fits a ways down on the ethics tree which we have been using as our reference point in prior lectures. Remember, the most basic division in ethics, as the study of human conduct, is the division between what we called philosophical and descriptive ethics. Anthropology, psychology, sociology, all of those disciplines study descriptive ethics. Philosophical ethics is the attempt not to describe what people do or what they believe morally, but rather to evaluate it. And so we'll be on the philosophical side of things once again today when we look at utilitarianism, because utilitarianism is a philosophical theory which tries to explain to us what our moral and our political and even our legal decisions should follow. So let's begin then by looking at what we'll call the elements of moral decision making. Any moral situation can be looked at from one of 3 possible different views. We could look at the dilemma from the agent's perspective, the person who is performing or thinking about performing the action. We could look at it from the action itself, or we could look at the situation from the consequences, from the situation of the consequences. So in front of you, you have then what you might call a little chart which has some symbols on it. Those symbols aren't particularly important, but I'm going to go to the board now and then look at this a little more closely. So we have the agent, the action or the act, and the consequences. And any moral situation can be looked at from any of these 3 perspectives. So let's look at lying, for example, to take lying as an example. We might look at the question of whether or not I should lie or should tell the truth from the perspective of the person considering the situation. So suppose it was Frank that was thinking about lying. We might look at Frank and we might ask, what are some virtues that Frank has? Or how would Frank feel about lying, or so forth. And in this case, we're looking not at the action or at the consequences of the situation, but at something having to do with Frank, the actor or the agent, right? So that's one way to look at the situation, the moral situation of lying. We might also shift gears and look at the action itself, right? Is there something about the words or the nature of lying itself which makes it right or wrong in a particular case? Of course, generally we would say that lying is a bad thing, but as we'll see as we go along here, it's not perhaps so clear that lying is always an immoral thing to do. So we might look at the agent Frank, we might look at the lying in and of itself, independent of Frank, or, and this is where we're going to spend our time today, we might look at the consequences of lying. What good or bad things might happen as a result of the lying or the not lying in this particular case. So this is one way for us to begin to get a handle on what is something that is actually very complex, and that's our ordinary, everyday moral decisions. So when we're confronted with a situation where we might be tempted to lie or to cheat or to steal, once we start to look at whether that action is right or wrong, it becomes clear pretty quickly. And if you've been paying attention in your class up to this point, you probably already know this, that the situation gets very complicated very quickly. And that's not actually the philosopher's fault, although we may be drawing your attention to it in a way that you hadn't been aware of before. So today we're going to look at utilitarianism, and utilitarianism is a consequentialistic theory. That's a very long word, consequentialistic, and it comes obviously from the word consequences. And so utilitarianism, as we'll see here in a second, is perhaps the most famous or most important consequentialistic theory that there is, right? Utilitarianism. And you either have or will in the future look at some other possibilities here. So if we go back to the PowerPoint slide then, what I've explained to you up to this point is simply what's going to occur on these next few slides. That there are agent-centered moral theories, there are act-centered moral theories, theories which look, whether certain acts like murder or lying are simply wrong as actions. And then there are consequentialistic theories, right? So on the consequentialistic theories, I've highlighted a couple of important points which are worth noting right here. It is not the action then which makes them good or bad, but the consequences. So the same action in two different situations might in one case be deemed good because of its good consequences, and the same act be deemed bad in a different situation. So utilitarianism then is a consequentialistic theory which says we should always choose the route which will promote the greatest good for the greatest number of people. All right. So we know one of the most important parts of utilitarianism, and that is the consequentialism. And let's look at a couple of other important points. 3 principles. The first principle simply states that when we're looking at a moral situation, it is the consequences which matter. All right? And we'll talk about how to weigh those consequences here in a second. That comes in the second principle, which says when we're weighing consequences, we choose the best or most useful consequences. And useful comes from the same root word as utility. There are different interpretations of that as we'll go along. So the first principle tells you where to look for your moral elements, and the second principle tells you how to weigh those elements, if that makes sense. So we weigh them trying to promote the most useful or the greatest good. You'll often hear people say the greatest good for the greatest number, and that comes from utilitarianism. The last principle is impartiality, which says that we have to consider everyone who is affected equally or fairly. And this is an important part of the impartiality, an important part of utilitarianism, which we'll see. I cannot simply choose the consequences which make me happy. In some cases, in many cases in our ordinary everyday life, utilitarianism will have no problem with us choosing things that make us happy. But that's not the only, if I'm not the only person involved, I can't just choose the consequences which make me happy. So let's go back to our lying example. Suppose I was planning on telling a lie, and I was going to tell a lie because I was scared that I would get in trouble if I told the truth. And this lie would hurt a lot of other people. Well, utilitarianism says that I have to consider not just myself, not just the consequences which will make me happy or sad, but we must consider everyone who is affected. And so, as we'll see, this impartiality principle is a crucial consideration for utilitarianism, and one which we'll have reason to revisit here in a second. So, these are the three principles of utilitarianism, and they result in a theory which has gained very wide popularity among people in the Western world. If we then proceed to the next slide, we'll see that the impartiality principle is sometimes called the altruism principle. And this is just the case that in certain situations, to do the action which promotes the greatest good will be to act selflessly. That is, we will sometimes be required, not all the time, but sometimes, according to utilitarianism, we will have to choose an action which does not make us happy, precisely because the greater good will be served. A third way of explaining the impartiality principle, or a third name for this, is sometimes called equality of consideration. So I think all three of those are getting at the same point. Okay, so I'm going to leave these up here and we'll go to the next slide and talk a little bit about Jeremy Bentham. The theory of utilitarianism is often traced to Jeremy Bentham. He was an English jurist who lived in the 18th and 19th centuries there. He was a social reformer and was interested in a morality and a political system which was beneficial to people here on earth, not necessarily in some future life or some heavenly existence, although he did not think that utilitarianism was necessarily against such religions, but merely that he thought the emphasis ought to be on government balancing the interests of the people, of all the people who are in or underneath the government's jurisdiction. So Bentham, very, very famous philosopher for lots of reasons, but primarily known for his theory of utilitarianism. Okay. Bentham, although he was the first utilitarian philosopher, was certainly not the last utilitarian philosopher. And there have been a lot of developments in utilitarian theory, just like there have been developments in almost all of the most important moral theories which have affected Western political theory. So we're going to look a little bit at Bentham's view, but realize that in many cases Bentham's own ideas have been surpassed, or modern utilitarians may not necessarily subscribe to all of these, because, as we'll see, some of them have caused difficulties for utilitarianism. So let's look at these aspects of Bentham's version of utilitarianism. Bentham was famous for saying that human beings were ruled by two masters, and only two masters. He said we were chained to these two masters, and these two masters were pain and pleasure, and that everything we did as human beings was about pain and pleasure. This is sometimes called hedonism, the idea that pleasurable sensations are good and painful or uncomfortable sensations are bad, and that is by definition. The other element which is important to realize is that Bentham was interested in what he called a science of ethics. He wanted to create a way of making moral decisions, a way of making political decisions, which was not subjective, that is, dependent on the feelings or the desires of the subject or the person who was making the decision. Rather, it was more objective, more like science, getting to hard truths or secure facts. And so Bentham was very much interested in creating what he called a hedonistic mathematics. And so Bentham actually called his system hedonistic calculus. And those two words are both important. Hedonistic meant looking at pleasures and pains. And calculus suggested that there was a way to mathematically weigh the pains and pleasures involved in any particular situation. So with Bentham, we have a moral system which is emphasizing aggregate pleasure. And aggregate just means total pleasure, or total happiness. So, again, for Bentham, we were looking at the greatest happiness possible. And if we were going to act morally, he said we would always choose the greatest good for the greatest number. Right? And as we'll see, both of these elements are important, and both of these elements can also be objected to or have some complications that we'll have to consider. So his version of utilitarianism, his hedonistic calculus, is called act utilitarianism because each act must be considered through its consequences. So, go back to that agent-act-consequence chart, and we'll remember that even though it's called act utilitarianism, the emphasis is on each act's consequences. We look at every act and we look not at the nature of the act itself, but at the consequences. Indeed, Bentham and utilitarians generally do not believe any act has on its own a moral weight. Lying is not good or bad in and of itself. Lying is bad when the consequences are bad, and good when the consequences are good or aggregately lead to total happiness, more happiness than telling the truth. So in some respects, this accords or agrees with our intuitions. We generally tend to think that lying is bad, but many of us, if not most of us, think that there are certain cases where lying is okay. And so utilitarianism has a way of explaining that by saying that, well, what makes lying morally acceptable in some cases and not in others is just the fact that sometimes the consequences of lying are generally good and promote happiness, and sometimes the consequences of lying are generally bad. Most utilitarians would say that if we weighed up the consequences, lying is usually wrong because it leads to bad consequences. All right. So let's put the theory into practice. And in order to do that, we will come back to the board here and take some examples of utilitarian or hedonistic calculus. Okay, so according to Bentham then, we should weigh up the positives and the negatives. That is, the pleasures and the displeasures of any situation. And we must weigh them for all the people who are involved. So we'll say person number 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And then these might be the same people having displeasures, or they might be different people here. Let's take an example. Let's stick with our example of lying. Or well, actually, let's take a different one. Let's take a form of lying which is cheating. So Here's our example is of cheating. So we're going to perform a utilitarian analysis of cheating. And because we cannot say ahead of time whether cheating is good or bad, we have to know what the possible consequences of the cheating are. So I'll fill in the example. I'll make it an imaginary example here to fill it in, and so we can kind of do some of this calculus here. So let's begin by saying, suppose the cheating is going to be done again by a fellow named Frank, and he's in an ethics class, and he's thinking about cheating on his final exam. And let's say if he cheats, Frank will be happy if he gets a good grade. So if he passes or gets away with his cheating, he will get to be happy. He will be very happy. Will anyone else be happy with Frank's cheating? Well, of course, we could fill out the situation in one way or another where perhaps there are people who might be happy with Frank's cheating, but generally the cheating is most beneficial for Frank, for the person who's thinking about doing it. Now, who might be unhappy with the cheating? Well, let's suppose that the professor doesn't like it when the students cheat, and let's say the other students in the class. And so student number 1, who has studied very hard, is going to be upset that Frank is cheating, and maybe student 2 will be upset, and so forth. We could go on down the line. Now, we also have to include here if Frank cheats and gets caught. So suppose going in, Frank is pretty sure that he can get away with the cheating. The professor's sort of a ditz or an airhead, doesn't watch what's going on, and Frank knows other people have cheated in the class, and so he thinks he can get away with it. So he's going to predict that he's happy, but it's also the case that Frank could be very sad if he gets caught. So if Frank gets caught, we would have to list this over on the displeasure side, right? Frank is possibly going to be unhappy if he gets caught. So when we're weighing up the pros and cons, even on something which seems fairly ordinary or everyday, we could see that it gets complicated from the utilitarian perspective very quickly. But let's set aside some of that complexity and try and push our way through and get to an answer. Now, suppose then that this is our situation. We have a couple of people who will be displeased if Frank cheats, and a couple of people who will be, or one person who will be happy if Frank cheats and gets away with it. So in this case, utilitarianism says we have to assign a value for every person who is affected. And in this case, we'll just use a scale of 1 to 10. And let's suppose that the higher the number, the more pleasurable, and likewise over here. So Frank will be very happy if he passes his exam. Let's say that's worth 9 points over here. And so our total pleasures will be 9. Our total displeasures have to count all of the people affected, not just Frank. So the professor will be upset, let's say mildly upset. One student might be even less upset than the professor, and one student might be very upset if Frank cheats. They don't like Frank anyway, and they worked really hard to study for the exam and so forth. And Frank, we'll suppose, perhaps is upset if he gets caught, and so you have to weigh that possible displeasure. And so when we add all these up, we get 8, 16, we get 20 displeasures, 20 points against. And so in this case, utilitarianism says that Frank should not cheat, right? That the cheating is not for the greatest good. If we change some of this, suppose none of the students cared, right, that Frank got caught, or excuse me, that Frank was cheating. Suppose he was the only one in the class, and he wasn't really worried too much about getting caught, what would happen if he got caught. Then you see our calculation changes, and in this situation then, it would not only be acceptable for Frank to cheat, it would be for the greatest good and therefore morally obligatory. Frank would be obligated to choose the cheating. That's because, again, on the utilitarian calculus, Frank's analysis suggests that the greatest good will be served in this case by cheating rather than not cheating. So a couple of, again, review points here. Cheating, according to utilitarianism, is not absolutely right or wrong. We cannot say that cheating is just bad. You shouldn't cheat. Because there are some cases where cheating is okay. And the same goes for every other situation. Lying, killing, terrorism. Most people think that torturing people is very bad, right? But according to utilitarianism, torture is good if it leads to good consequences, and bad if it leads overall to bad consequences. And so there is, in theory, nothing out of bounds for utilitarianism until you weigh the consequences. All right. So let's return then to talk about some developments in utilitarian theory. Utilitarianism is a very important and remains a very popular political theory and moral theory, but there have been some important developments or challenges to utilitarianism over the years. And so we'll just mention a few of these. This is not an exhaustive list, but a couple of them are important enough to mention here this morning. The first is what is sometimes called rule utilitarianism. Part of the problem with Bentham's original formulation, which we called act utilitarianism, was that it seemed in certain cases to require actions which we found to be very distasteful. So, for example, let us suppose that that we could kill one person and harvest their organs to save 9 other people. In that case, it seems, again, that utilitarianism is requiring us to murder someone in order to promote the greatest good. And as we'll see here in a slide or two, there are other kinds of objections like this which have given utilitarians fits or problems. And so there was a version of utilitarianism which is called rule utilitarianism, which says instead of focusing on particular actions in particular situations, you simply come up with rules or general principles which promote the greatest good for the greatest happiness. And that way we could say, for example, that murder generally promotes great displeasure, great problem, great suffering in the world. And so we'll just say, instead of looking at every possible situation where one might be tempted to murder another person, we would just say that there's a rule that murder doesn't promote the greatest good, and you should just follow the rule rather than looking at every particular act. And you'll probably have a chance to see how this works in some class participation exercises and so forth. So I'll leave that development there and move on to the second one. The second one is in perhaps even more perplexing development in utilitarian theory. And this is the question of how we are to define utility. As we've already seen, Bentham defined it as pleasure. And he made no distinctions about kinds of pleasures. And according to Bentham, indeed, all pleasures were equal. His famous phrase is, "Pushpin is as good as poetry." And pushpin was a kind of a children's game. And of course, poetry would have been an intellectual kind of pleasure, perhaps, loved by the literate classes or something. And Bentham said that it didn't matter what made you happy, as long as it made you happy, right? And so for Bentham, all pleasures were equal. And this is what became known then as the hedonistic view of utility. Hedonism is an approach to happiness which says that it's all about pleasure. And pleasure is the most important thing. Okay, so this was Bentham's definition of utility, and it was that what mattered was pleasure and that all kinds were equal. And then the problem with that is that some people, for example Mill, John Stuart Mill and others, have said that there are various types of pleasures and some are higher than others. All right. The idea here is that, perhaps physical pleasures are important. The taste of a good wine, or the feel of a summer breeze, or a good swim in a pool is physically pleasurable. But it's not as important, say, as an emotional pleasure, like the love of a father for a son, or maybe an intellectual kind of pleasure. Some philosophers have thought that there is a kind of gradation or a ladder of pleasures, with physical pleasures being on the bottom. And the most important pleasures having to do more with intellectual or emotional kinds of things. Bentham didn't like this definition of utility because it made his calculus much more difficult. If all pleasures are equal, then your math, when you're trying to weigh up your consequences, is a little more simple. You don't have to decide whether Frank's fear of getting caught is on the same level as the injustice that the professor feels, or something like that. And so Bentham did not like this version, but Mill thought it was just an empirical fact that people generally preferred certain kinds of pleasure over other kinds of pleasure. Yes, we all enjoyed eating a good meal and so forth, but we would, when forced to choose, we would always choose love or friendship more highly than the pleasure we got out of a good meal. Part of the question here then is whether happiness is equal to goodness or rightness. And I'll put a question mark here because remember, Bentham thought that it was just the case that everyone chooses their actions based on whether it's going to make them happy, or is going to lead to pleasurable sorts of things. But we could question that and ask whether happiness really was the same thing as goodness. Are people really ruled by the desire to get pains or pleasures? And even if they were, does that mean that we ought to equate, literally say, happiness is the same thing as goodness? So we could we could give an example here. Suppose that someone is happy, but we would not think that they're necessarily good. Right? So suppose they're happy because they like doing drugs and sitting in their basement and watching old movies or something like that. And they're really happy, they enjoy their life, but they don't have any friends, and they're not really involved in their community, and they're sort of a jerk to other people. And so we might ask whether, although they claim to be happy, they're not really acting or leading a life that is a good life. And so some people have suggested that utilitarians and others are making a mistake here. I'll say one more thing here, and that's the idea of useful. Utility comes from the word useful, or is the same root, comes from the same stem. And we can ask the same thing of useful that we did of happiness, namely whether usefulness is the same thing as goodness. Simply because something makes us happy or is useful to us personally does not necessarily mean it is good. Okay, so let's look at one final development in utilitarian theory, and this would be particularly important for political philosophy and for social philosophers to consider, and this is the question of utility and human rights. A human right is, well, it's a good question what a human right is, but human rights are very popular ways of talking about moral situations these days, and utilitarians have different approaches to whether or not their theory endorses or accepts things like human rights. So if we would list some important human rights like the right to life, the right to freedom of thought, the right to vote, the right not to be beaten up or tortured, if we were to count all of those as important, some utilitarians would say that utilitarian theory gives us certain rights because those rights are useful. John Stuart Mill was a famous, again, British philosopher who believed that there were such things as human rights, but they were founded on utilitarian foundation. That is that when we look at the consequences of giving people human rights, it's generally a good thing. It promotes their happiness and the happiness of society, and so we base human rights on utilitarian thinking. Bentham, however, thought that was nonsense. His famous phrase is nonsense on stilts. He didn't think there were such things as human rights. They were just made up, imagined. They were created by human imagination, and really everything reduced to utility. And many people have used human rights to criticize utilitarian theory because they want to say that human rights can never be overridden by utility or are not founded on utility. So that would explain, for example, why you couldn't kill one person and harvest their organs, because they have a right to life. And no matter how many people you could save a person who needs a heart and a person who needs some lungs and other people who need blood and liver and kidneys. But some would say you can't ever kill a person even if it would save 10 people, because you would violate their human right. So this question of whether or not utilitarianism endorses or accepts human rights is an important one and part of the development of utilitarian theory. Okay, let's move on to the very last part of the lecture here, which is to talk about some influences and to revisit some of the objections to utilitarian theory. Moral theory in the United States and in the West very generally, and also in parts of the East, has had a lot of influence. Utilitarian moral theory has had a lot of influence, in part because it is, at least on the face of it, a non-religious and objective way to make moral and political decisions. Again, non-religious in the sense that it's not making direct reference to God, or to God's commandments, other than to say perhaps that God wants people to be happy and so forth. But it is also said to be objective in the sense that it's not dependent upon any individual person's desires or virtues, so forth. In the United States anyway, and in Great Britain as well, the political and legislative influence of utilitarianism has been great. You may often hear politicians talk about balancing the interests of the people, and that's a model of utilitarian, or a way of thinking about utilitarianism. I'm a visual learner, so I'll draw a little picture here, right? On the balancing model, right, you have to make a decision, and you have to choose between the good or the bad. And if you have 30 people over here who would benefit from passing this law, and you have 10 people over there who would be upset if you passed the law, some politicians say, well, I have to choose what's the best for the most people. And so I will vote for the law, or if I'm a king, I will enact the law, right? Because it's good for the people, right? Or good for more people than it is for bad. So the model here then is of a weighing, right? The good and bad. And if the good goes up, then that's what we're supposed to choose. Utilitarianism has also had important influence on punishment. In many countries, prisons are now called correctional facilities. Why do we call them correctional facilities? Well, it's because we're trying to correct people, or reform them, and to deter those persons from creating or committing crimes in the future. And that is obviously a plea to promote the greatest happiness, right? And so utilitarianism has had a lot of influence in the area of punishment. And lastly, and perhaps most revolutionary, is the question of whether animals have to be considered in our weighing of the good and bad consequences of actions. If something that makes me happy kills another living being or causes it suffering, like eating cow meat, hamburger, steaks, New York strips, and I have to kill another living being, and that being suffers because of my wanting to get the pleasure of eating its meat, then we may ask the question of whether that really is a utilitarian, is endorsed by utilitarianism, is the right thing to do according to utilitarianism. And in the past couple of hundred years, there's been an expansion of interest in including animals in our moral decision making. And some of that is due to utilitarianism, which says that what counts is pain and pleasure, and if animals suffer pains and pleasures, then by the impartiality principle, we have to include them, right? So just as Bentham had said early on, you can't exclude poor people from political decisions just because they're poor, right? Poor people, people who don't have a lot of money, suffer just the same way rich people do. And you can't just say, well, because I'm wealthy and I'm politically powerful, I'm going to ignore poor people, right? Some modern day moral philosophers have said, well, the same thing applies to cows. Just because you can push a cow around doesn't mean that you can ignore the cow's suffering, right? And so animal rights movements have been influenced, at least some of them have been influenced by utilitarianism's impartiality principle. And that was that the third principle there under the principles of utilitarianism we looked at earlier. Okay, let's finish up by looking at a couple of objections. Some of these objections we've already hinted at here a little bit. The first objection to utilitarianism is that the theory has placed too much emphasis on consequences. Remember our very first objection, or our very first slide on moral elements, had the agent, the act, and the consequences, and different moral theories have claimed that while the consequences might be important, they're not the only thing that are important. So some people will say human rights are important, we were just talking about. Or some people will say, isn't there something called justice, which should be included in our decision-making process? Other people will say, well, what about desert? Suppose that you could punish me, and it would make people feel better if you punished me, even if I didn't do the crime. Right? People are scared, and they want to feel better, and they'll feel better if you tell them that I did it, and you threw me in jail. But wait a minute, doesn't that throw out the idea of desert? I don't deserve to go to jail because I didn't do the crime. And so some people will say that, look, utilitarianism is ignoring these other moral considerations, like human rights, like justice, like the concept of deserving certain things based on our past actions. So as you go into the theory and as you apply it in your class and in your exercises, I think you'll see that these other moral considerations come up pretty quickly. Although utilitarianism has an answer to all of them, which is just to say that if you think about it carefully enough, you'll see that all of these things reduce to the greatest good for the greatest number in particular cases. Okay. Item B there is well, as I say there are certain cases which conflict with our common sense moral judgment. So the case of killing one person to farm out their organs to save 10 people who need organ transplants. Some people say, well, that we couldn't possibly do that. And because utilitarianism seems to tell us that that is morally required, then that shows that utilitarianism is a bad moral approach or a bad moral theory. Other people will say, for example, that some actions are just wrong no matter what the consequences. So in the United States, we are currently having a debate on whether torture is acceptable. And some people think that torture is acceptable if the person we're torturing is, a terrorist or knows about terrorists, and we could save a lot of people, potentially save a lot of people's lives if we torture this person to try and get information out of them. And that would be a very utilitarian approach, by the way. Right? The torture isn't wrong in and of itself. It's only wrong if it leads to bad consequences. And other people will say, wait a minute, torture is just plain wrong. The act of torturing another person can never be endorsed. And so there are examples like torture or perhaps rape or other sorts of very, what we normally think of as very violent or terrible crimes or injustices, which, again, by utilitarian standards, are not necessarily going to be immoral. Okay, and the third thing we also already talked about a little bit, so I won't mention too much here, but it's the question of what is utility? What is happiness? Is that the only thing that we should be considering? So we have those objections which have to do with people's preferences and the things that make them happy, which we may not think really are things that should be counted in our moral consideration. So if it makes me happy to torture cats, well, it may make me happy, but it's not clear that we should count that happiness in our moral considerations. So those are the three objections that I mentioned there. Your book and your particular professor and your working class may lead you to some other objections to utilitarianism. And really, utilitarianism has some objections or some replies to these objections, and as you see, the theory is a powerful one, and that explains, of course, in part why it has lasted so long here in Western culture. So that is the end. I bid you farewell and enjoy the further explorations in doing some utilitarian calculus with your classmates and your professors.